theory has been characterized as doing its political and cultural work, working it, we might say, by the play of its own style. The incarnation of style as a narcissistic devotion to the surface is one of the cliched figures the work registers as queer. The cliches of queer as the aesthetic and fleshed live and bleed in the branding stereotypes of a queer subject marked and constructed from a flaming outside. The branding stereotype of the queer as aesthetics incarnate figures the queer subject as consumed by the fashion, but also tarted up by the tarnished brush of the taste of which the queer subject is at once positioned as the avant-garde arbiter, and yet also the shamed dupe. It's not at all surprising, then, that the subject of aesthetics might make us squirm. Skewered as we are, or threatened to be, on the glittered but no less pointed end of our own efforts to turn the conditions and signs of stigmatic injury into the sites of, if not flourishing with an extra flourish, then survival with tattered sequins. We may refuse the portrayal of queer as the aesthetic, or to recirculate the late Jose Munoz's so redolent term for the negotiation of a highly charged ambivalence of attraction laced with repulsion, routed not to some fantasized outside, but through the very figures that may most painfully stick to us, and to which we may find ourselves strangely attached. Disidentify, grudgingly through the adhesion of queer and aesthetic. Yet the monocled aesthete, as the slithering incarnation of the sibilant of style, joins the burlesque striptease that peels down to the nothing to see but the mirror ball shimmers of the substance of style, in what I suggest we might take as one of the most durably provocative propositions of what has come to be known as queer theory. Aesthetics is us. And not just in the sense of a history of the invention of a typology of deviance and excess, in which the norm gets to hold the illusion of an ostensibly unstudied naturalness, and mannerism comes to mark the margins. The aesthetic, queer theory so powerfully insists, performs. And we might even say that aesthetics does us, down to the bone. As a corollary to its radical revision of surface depth distinctions, some of queer theory's most daring provocations, not least Judith Butler's extension of the performative in Bodies That Matter, to argue that compelled citation of the sense, or the nonsense of the norms of sex and gender, does not culturally dress a body, but materializes that body. Positions aesthetics, or the social and political system of style and form, as the matter not of a decorative surface, but the shaping of the life and death stakes of what counts as the form of a livable life and a grievable death. As a dazzlingly grave matter of judgment and determinations of value, aesthetics emerges via the swerve and the drag of queer theory as the losses inherent in the form of conformity, what Butler characterizes in Melancholy Gender as the pathetic repudiations of normative gender, the never-never of being the man or the woman one claims to be, on the basis of the man or the woman one claims never to have loved, and thus could never lose. And the exquisite risks of a politics hinged, if not to the formless, then the exploded or incoherent, that suggests and even begins to materialize another world out of its daring to live in and through the losses not repudiated. To put this another way, rather than merely a subjectless theory, queer theory offers us aesthetics, the charged relations between affects, form, and the virtualization and materialization of the glimmer of other bodies, communities, and worlds, as a vital resource for living and working in the situation of precarity, in the muck of mixed feelings, and amidst the constraining field of taint and compromise, without a reliable exit sign by which to find a way to an autonomous outside. Queer aesthetics, I propose, is not a redundancy, but a practice of the bristle, not necessarily of binary contrasts, but of the frictions of both and tensions. While aesthetics may brand the queer with the cliche of the aesthete, aesthetics also queers the seeming solidity, naturalness, and innocence of the forms of the norm. Aesthetics shows up the performance of body, world, and home to be not just susceptible to drag and to cam. As the triple click of red glitter heels also insinuates, it's not just in Oz, but in the banal everyday theater of compulsory performance, that worlds are materialized and altered in and by the repetitions and recyclings of which drag and camp are merely its most flamboyant extensions, apparent extremities that curl back to point implicatingly at the backyard of home as its own camping ground. What I'm presenting isn't a straight-up genealogy of aesthetic as a key term of queer theory. Even if such a genealogy could be done, it would crucially miss the extent to which the aesthetic is key to queer theory, but in ways far more constitutive and extensive than is indicated by the actual instances of the term's appearance. For one actually finds the key term aesthetic fairly rarely in the theoretical text that one might argue constitute queer theory's anti-foundational foundations. And this is of interest, I think, to those of us who practice. Aesthetics is key, rather, to queer theory's most basic methods. Aesthetics is the engine of the piercing and also roving swerves of queer theory's version of a certain kind of détournement, performed by the appropriative rerouting of the terms and demands of the dominant, while holding onto and keeping company with the damaged, the stigmatic, the shaming, the anachronistic, and the seemingly better left behind. Swerves enabled by the aesthetic that make certain conceptual and materializing terms thinkable, dreamable, even perhaps inhabitable. Aesthetics is what makes queer theory's methods inseparable from its stylizations, condensed, for example, in the gestures of its very nominative, queer. The aesthetic, we might say, is what motors queer theory's ongoing verve, the extent to which it invites volatilizing swerves that shake the conventional holds of the common sense ways of making sense of sex and gender in the here and now. Or rather, what my friend Shel Isaac, in homage to the imminent potential of queer in the sense of an as yet that's called in by the acting as if, so exquisitely reformulated as the queer and near. And I'd like to suggest that such glimmerings of the queer and near begin to come into appearance and even materialization in the recycling scenes of camp. It's in the work on camp to which I now turn that we especially find aesthetics mobilized as a key term of consequence for queer theory. I was asked a decade ago to review Fabio Plato's Camp, Queer Aesthetics and the Performing Subject for our journal. I found myself deeply ambivalent about the anthology in ways that crystallized for me in its cover image. And while I find myself no less ambivalent today, I'd suggest that Camp's vibrancy and even urgency persists for me as an aesthetic tactics for staging the negotiation of deep and profound ambivalence that keeps criticality and creativity, the anticipation of injury, and an openness to wonder and surprise in tension and thus in play. Reconceived as perversely delightful refracting prisms with the transformative capacity to turn the pain of abjection into dazzling rainbow effects, diamonds, it seems, might still be a girl's best friend. Or rather, as the introductory number by literary queer studies scholar Fabio Plato that opens the reader would have it, the diamond is a materializing figure for camp, and camp is still a girl's best queer aesthetic survival tool. Reclaiming camp as a means to revision history and dominant culture, the camp reader gives contemporary queer cultural production and aesthetic tactics a long genealogy reaching into the early modern period. The diamond, or diamond-like prism of Plato's contextualizing introduction, recasts camp in a bent genealogical line that one might imagine extending from the gorgeous horror of the many elegant bump and grind drags on Marilyn Monroe, in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and if you haven't seen it, you should, back to Sir Isaac Newton's color experiments in the privation of a dark room. The camp reader performs the old substitution striptease of erotic and material promise, proffering us this diamonds are a girl's best friend set piece, once more with feeling, to reclaim and reposition camp as not merely a pre-Stonewall closet practice, or bourgeois appropriation of aesthetic goods claimed as the gay property of Bohemia, but also as an unstable, mobile, and yet powerful progressive tool, that's Plato's phrasing, for contemporary queer cultural activism. The camp reader deploys the metaphor of the diamond, yet again precisely to cut into the frozen or even congealed spectacle of camp as commodified cultural object, and works to rescue camp as a prismatic refractor whose very, quote, degree of diversity and heterogeneity, of disagreement and discursive contest, makes it repositionable as a queer device for breaking into and breaking up canons of objects and taste, questioning how we look and how we value. The self-conscious structure of the camp reader, or its architecture, mirrors how the reader conceptualizes the operations of camp as a refracting prism that, with its effects, both creates and transforms spaces in the manner of a fantastic, gravity-defying, twisted building, replacing the illusion of firm foundations with an occupiable campground of sparkling, shifting sands. The Victorian English word camp, the introduction asserts, cannot be adequately translated out of English. And yet, working against the Anglo-US bias of much scholarship on camp, the reader compellingly offers other etymologies that trace the word into the French word se camper, for to posture boldly, or flaunt, and the Italian verb campeggiare, for to stand out. Strikingly, the reader pulls from the mining and classical Greek, from Titian and Vermont in their Ruses of Intelligence, to take camp back even further to the Indo-European root calm, applied to that which is curved, flexible, articulated. This digging after other Indo-European origins of the term camp, beyond the Anglo-Saxon, ends up linking camp and queer as cognates for the posturing occupation and transmogrification of space. This prehistory of the term and the spatial practices of camping constructs camp as a queer discursive architecture, an operation of camping up that affects the paradoxical and even outlaw alteration of space by the, quote, erection of ephemeral apparatuses traced in a queer genealogy back to French and Italian Renaissance and Baroque ephemeral architecture, mobile and temporary triumphal arches, garden surprises, faux facades, evanescent fireworks, among other spatial games and optical tricks. Camping thus emerges as an ephemeral architecture, or queer spatial practice of the social event and the political battleground. However, for a project that positions itself as an intervention in the larger field of aesthetics, I wonder if the politics of the decision not to include any illustrations besides the cover image of the acrobats Darlie Smith, Jewel Wadek, and Jimmy Carrigan performing a stunt atop a New York City skyscraper with the Empire State Building rhyming in the background the upward reach of their muscled bodies. The unabashed and bravura display of the phallicized body, rivaling the exclamation point of the built tower, works against the reader's careful positioning to counter the visual stereotype of camp as white, gay male bodily excess, that's here still staked, despite all the camp jokes on phallicized masculinity, to an aesthetics, albeit largely inflated, of grandiose erection. And yet the afterlives of this review of the camp reader and the recycling of the reader itself attest to camp as a stage set and stage setting flexible architectural resource for propping and even sustaining the viability of other possibilities within its scene of an at once spectacular appearance and absence. Sculptor Anna Campbell's reflection beam took my review not to replace one cover image with another, but to coach the mirror prism of camp as a tool for materially articulating another edifice at the place where fascination meets frustration, and we might call this intersection desire. Frustration and even outrage at the degree to which the scale for what may even register as queer, or camp for that matter, is calibrated to a certain kind of muscled white gay masculinity as its standard unit of measure, which renders other forms and incarnations of potent gender and sex play in the zone of the illegible and incalculable. And yet perversely, fascinated by the way in which the standard unit of architectural construction, the I-beam, with its cross-section flanges that help resist buckling and bending, could be appropriated to make a pedestal support that bends in another way. Faced with mirrors that don't completely cover the wood beams and thus refuse seamless illusionism, the anti-foundational quasi-support of the pedestal, tower becomes the prop, not just for an ever-growing accumulation of discount camp readers, but especially by its use of the mirrors to bisect and double the image, pushing its acrobatic assemblage of bodies toward a monstrous conjoining. The mirror of misrecognition and splitting images and imagos becomes not merely the putting into the scene of, in Campbell's phrasing, some post-disco flamboyance, but a refractor by which we're ushered into the scene of shifting ephemeral foundations. as both